A study of the rent control policy in San Francisco found that it actually increased the number of evictions that landlords filed due to the fact that they had to evict their tenants in order to raise the rent. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over a study that they did over the San Francisco rent control policy. Now, obviously, landlords here who watch my videos know that I am not a fan of rent control, but I like to point out the facts. I like to point out the facts for those people who do not believe me when I say that, hey, rent control policies, they don't work and they have unintended consequences. For example, there's just going to be less rental units available as landlords exit the market, and there's landlords who are going to work and try to get workarounds. They're going to use any method possible in order to raise their rents up. Okay, so they think the solution to this is, oh, we're going to pass more laws, more rules, more regulations. We're going to make it harder for landlords to get around these artificial price controls that we put in place. But the only thing they're really doing is scaring away more landlords. They're causing any rentals that are not under these rent control policies, the prices to skyrocket, and they're making housing more scarce and less affordable overall for all tenants out there. So yeah, rent control doesn't work. We know that. This study, further proves it. And I hope that the people who watch my videos who think that rent control is a good idea, they listen to the information that I'm going to be bringing here in just a moment. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Now, I'm just curious for those landlords out there, before you owned any rental properties, did you actually believe that these artificial price controls, price caps, rent control would actually work? I know when I was young, very naive, I didn't understand economics. I actually thought that, oh, the government, if they just said, well, you can't increase the price of this thing, well, that would make sure the prices remain low. What I didn't realize was that by the prices being artificially kept low, it actually would cause a shortage as people started to gobble up the number, they started to gobble up those cheaper, priced items, right? And then there'd be less available for those who wanted them or needed them later on going on to the future. So the only way we could get them at that point would be to, kind of go into the black market, pay extra, and then you end up paying more than what the market rate would have been in the first place. So, that's simplified version of why rent control doesn't work. But anyway, let's get into this article. This article is coming from reason.com, and it says, study, San Francisco rent control expansion led to more evictions. A new study from researchers at Northwestern University found that landlords were incentivized by rising prices to replace existing tenants with new market rate paying tenants. And they go over the San Francisco rent control law when it was implemented. So, it's not something that's more recent that the information they're going over. So anyway, let's get into it. More moderate supporters of rent control will often argue that while the policy does constrain housing supply, it is nevertheless an effective means of keeping longtime tenants in their homes. The trick for policymakers is to balance these two goods of supply and stability. But new research suggests that rent control might be a poor means of providing tenant stability as well. A paper published last month by Northwestern University's Elad Geddes and Nicole Holes on SSRN and summarized in a Cato Institute research brief published yesterday found that the 1995 expansion of San Francisco's rent control law led to an increase in both evictions and complaints about wrongful evictions being filed with the city's rent board. We found that eviction notices filed with the rent board increased by 83%, and that the number of wrongful eviction claims increased by 125% in zip codes with the average level of new exposure to rent control, write the researchers. And that doesn't even include the number of people that landlords just paid to, hopefully get them out of those units. So you have a rent that is set at a certain level, and the only way that you can raise the rent up to the market level is by getting rid of that tenant. Well, a landlord might come in there and say, hey, my property will be valued so much higher if I get rid of this tenant, plus the amount of rents that I'll make over the course of however long, right? And it will be worth it for me to pay this tenant to actually leave the property, so no eviction would be involved at all. So yeah, there will be an increase in eviction cases, especially when these laws are brand new, because if they put that exception in there saying that, oh yeah, tenants, if you have tenant turnover, you can raise the rent up on the next tenant. Well, landlords are going to want to, have as much tenant turnover as possible. San Francisco's original 1979 rent control ordinance limits rent increases in buildings with five or more units occupied that year or before to 60% of inflation. In 1994, San Francisco voters passed a referendum that expanded those controls to 1979 buildings of 1 to 4 units. The law went into effect the next year. The city's sudden expansion of rent control has proven a fruitful development for researchers. A landmark 2019 study from Stanford researchers found that after the expansion, tenants in pre 1980 buildings were less likely to have moved than tenants in non rent controlled buildings. The same study also found that the supply of rental housing fell by 15% as landlords converted their buildings to condominiums or otherwise withdrew them from the rental market. So, yeah, there you go, right there. 15% of the rental units available out there just completely disappeared. And then the people who were in those old rent control buildings, they were far, far less likely to move than people who otherwise, like in regular market rate rentals, would move. Okay, so I've seen this research, I've seen studies, and this is just talking about market rate rentals throughout the US, right? In general, tenants only stay in an apartment for 2 years. So when you see, a market like San Francisco and you got people in there who are staying for 10, 20, 30 plus years inside a rental unit, this is not a natural market. Okay, this isn't natural turnover, and that there is some kind of government price control in place that is keeping these tenants from moving. That lends credence to the idea that rent control provides a mix of stability for incumbent tenants and less availability and higher prices for new entrants in the rental housing market. San Francisco's rent control ordinance allows landlords to reset rents to market rates for a new tenant, a policy known as vacancy control. The Stanford study found that this gave landlords an incentive to get rid of rent controlled tenants when rents started to rise quickly. So yeah, whenever the market, right, which San Francisco is a wildly, high increases of prices a lot of the time, right? I believe right now they are actually declining in prices, but over time their prices have increased exponentially within the city. And as soon as the landlord sees that, right, they're like, hey, we need to get rid of these tenants with these super low rents. And so they start, filing evictions for stuff that otherwise they might have let slide. They just want to get these tenants up out of there because they cannot raise the rent on them. So the rent control law actually was increasing. It caused an increase of evictions within the city. Now, obviously, since implementing the rent control law, they've done everything possible to make it as difficult as possible for landlords to be able to remove tenants. And they've added all these new rules, all these new regulations to make it even harder for landlords to make money, because once they realize that landlords are using these loopholes, the only solution they have is to pass more laws until they hopefully can destroy the profits of landlords and enable the tenant to stay in these units forever. But they actually address that issue here in this article. So I'm going to skip down a little bit, right? And it says rent control supporters typically argue that these aren't problems with rent control, they're problems with loopholes to rent control. They can therefore be fixed by eliminating vacancy control, restricting condo conversions, stepping up enforcement activities against illegal evictions. New York's 2019 changes to its rent stabilization law that covers close to 1 million apartments in New York City were guided by these principles. It eliminated various means by which landlords could remove their units from rent control, reset rents to market rates, and pass on the cost of capital improvements to tenants. The financial returns from operating rent stabilized units have fallen dramatically as a result, leading landlords to claim their buildings are being defunded. There's some evidence that unit quality is falling and vacancies are increasing as owners have fewer funds and less incentive to maintain occupied units and renovate empty ones. And see, there you go, right there. They say, hey, all these, we're going to close all these loopholes and prevent landlords from being able to basically raise the rents to be able to cover their costs, right? And the result is the properties fall into disrepair. The owners are keeping their units empty rather than fixing them up and re-renting them. Okay, unintended consequences of the laws that they pass. And, this is the kind of stuff that they think, like I said, they think that more laws, more rules, more regulations, and you'll start to see them come out with stuff now saying, oh, well, landlords, we're going to pass another law saying landlords won't be able to keep their units empty. They won't be able to warehouse their units. I talked about that issue in another video. And, like, you can't force a landlord to rent a property out if they don't want to do it. If a unit's sitting empty, they don't want to fix it up, you cannot force a landlord to rent it out. So, yeah, just another article talking about the failings of rent control, why it doesn't work. I hope that the people who I'm trying to deliver this message to watch this video, read the article. I'll put a link to it in the description.